Welcome to our LPC meeting. I thought I mentioned this last time that moving on being the new, the new conductor of this meeting after Mayor Silvestrini, we're going to do a quick me in a minute. And so you're going to get tapped eventually. And we have tapped somebody to come up and tell us about himself. So come on up, Mayor Burton, and do me in a minute for us.
Good afternoon. My name is Dirk Burton. I'm the mayor of West Jordan, and I hope to be that for more than a minute. A little something about me. I come from a good-sized family. I'm the middle child in my family of my siblings. There are 6 older and 6 younger than me. I tell people that's where I learned to negotiate, and it's still coming through today. And that's also when I learned to start riding bicycles as a child. My older brothers had a bike, and I used to stick my leg through that little bar and diddy there and pedal that way, and started riding even way back then. I remember walking over to the nearby Western Auto and buying bearings for a nickel to stick in my bike to repair it because I had to fix my own bicycle, and come back home and go for a bike ride. And so today I still ride bikes. I think it's great. West Jordan is a fantastic city. It's the 3rd largest city in the state of Utah. We passed Provo, who used to be 3rd.
Okay,
now
but
they're
it was
4th.
during COVID and the students were gone. I might fight you.
But anyway, West Jordan is also an old city. You know, it got its name because people would go over the Jordan River, which was at the west side of the river, and so they called it West Jordan. And all that was West Jordan. And it was established in 1848, and we became a city later on. So we are an old city, but yet we're a fast-growing city, so we're a new city. So we're putting in water tanks one after another after another. At the same time, we're replacing the old water pipes and lines that have been there forever. One we replaced last year was an old wooden one that was still in service when we replaced it, and it was made out of wood, and it was still going. So we have a lot of cool things that happen in West Jordan. A couple of the things about me: I love to ski. I snow ski, I water ski. I like to bike ride, I like to whitewater raft, I like to rock climb, I like to rappel even more. So after I climb up, I like to go back down and enjoy that as well. And I have a lot of fun with things like that. I've got 6 kids. I got 10 grandkids, and my one son lives in Driggs, Idaho. So my last bike ride that I did, that took more than a day, was riding back home from Driggs, Idaho, back over to West Jordan. That took me 3 days. It was great. My first night I stayed in Soda Springs, Idaho. The second night was in Logan, and the third night was in West Jordan. So I love being the mayor. I love life. Thank you for letting me come and talk to you about me. If you want to hear more, please come visit us at West Jordan or westjordan.utah.gov.
That was perfect. Thank you, Mayor Burton. It was ended with the perfect public announcement. Also, raise your hand if you've never been to one of these before. Okay. Well, this location is really fun, right? Thank you for hosting us, actually, Bountiful. This is a really nice city hall. I just want to tell those that are new that there's a lot that gets said, and a lot of it is overwhelming, and there's a lot of acronyms. So if you feel like you're lost, don't worry, because we all kind of do at times in these meetings. But just hang in there and keep showing up. Okay, at this time, we need a motion to approve the October minutes. Thank you. We have a motion, and I need a second. Second. All right, any discussion? All right, let's go ahead and call it to a vote. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed? Perfect, the motion carries. With that said, just a couple housekeeping details. We do have a large number on Zoom, so if you can raise your hand on Zoom, we'll keep our eye on you. The other piece is make sure you're talking to the microphone loud so that those on Zoom can hear you. And I will now turn the time over to Cam, and it looks like, yeah, and Carson actually too. Both of you are on right now. And then we'll just follow the agenda.
Welcome everyone. Thank you, Bountiful City, for hosting LPC today in person. Thank you also to the League Board of Directors. We met this morning down in our humble abode at the League. In hindsight, maybe we should have just done both meetings here, but we got here, right?
I think you the fastest directions to get.
That's true. That's true. The League Board this morning really focused on 2 big policy topics. Policy topic number 1 being housing with relation to the Unified Economic Opportunity Commission meeting coming up next week, and homelessness. So we'll come back to homelessness momentarily. For the Unified Economic Opportunity Commission piece, we have several items we want to bring to you for your consideration today. First, you'll see the item on the agenda is the survey research and survey results and outreach. Over the last few weeks, Carson Eilers on our team has been reaching out to you to gather important data sets that we are presenting to state leaders this week.
Yeah, I just want to stress the importance when league staffs ask for your staff to provide information like they did this time on some data about, this is all about the housing space. It's super important that we all try to respond as quickly as we can. One of the best tools that we have been able to marshal against the Property Rights Coalition with respect to housing issues is actually data, science. So if we don't have that data, then we can't be as effective in advocacy with respect to some of these issues. For example, we're basically able to show how many housing units have been entitled in our state in the last year. It's like there are like 90,000 entitlements. So when the property rights community says we're not entitling enough housing, actually, we're not doing nothing here. We are actually making progress. So, but without that data, that we can't make those arguments. So please encourage your staff when you get a request to respond to it timely. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you, Mayor and President. We've got a big year ahead, and thank you, Mayor Silvestrini. As a reminder, Unified Economic Opportunity Commission includes the governor, the Senate president, Speaker of the House, the governor's cabinet. Mayor Ramsey from South Jordan is the league's rep, and then UEC has a representative as well. Underneath, there are a whole bunch of other groups, and then even underneath that are a whole bunch of additional groups. What we've brought to you in the past has been focused on the Commission on Housing Affordability, which is a subgroup of the UEOC, and then the three subgroups therein. The Attainable Housing Group has been the one that's focused the most on land use authority. Okay. As he's pulling that up, the UEOC will next meet next Tuesday. Last week, the Commission on Housing Affordability met and considered the Property Rights Coalition proposals, which we brought to this meeting before, but also considered the League's counter proposals that we developed over the course of the last month. At the October LPC, we showed you what we referred to as our wireframe, and we talked about the subdivisions streamlined concept that is really the centerpiece of our counter proposal. And that would be that state law would define how that subdivision process works, the role of public input, and the timing of the two different reviews, preliminary plat review and final plat review, and who ultimately does the final plat review. That's been the centerpiece of our proposal, and Mayor Silvestrini and I last Tuesday presented our counter proposal and countered and argued against most of the PRC proposals. As we mentioned in Friday Facts, they got to the end of the meeting, and the motion that they ultimately considered basically said we're going to take every item that the Property Rights Coalition and the League has put forward, and we're going to advance them to the UEOC, but empower the co-chairs to work with the League and the PRC to come up with the actual proposal. So they did not take a vote, an up and down vote on our counter proposal, nor did they take an up and down vote on the Property Rights Coalition proposal. They simply advanced everything and said, co-chairs, figure this out. So we'll be meeting again with the co-chairs this week because it's interim week. And then Mayor Ramsey will be casting a vote next week. Now, to Mayor Ramsey's credit, last year there was only one vote before the UEOC that was not unanimous, and that was because she was the nay vote on the retail incentives bill. But we kept negotiating that, even though the governor voted yes, the speaker voted yes, the Senate president voted yes. She voted no, but kept the dialogue open so we could negotiate that bill to a better spot. Still too early to tell what's going to happen next week at the UEOC, but the League board this morning basically empowered her to vote in a way that keeps the League at the table while still making it crystal clear that we oppose most of those PRC proposals, which include things like making general plans binding or allowing by right housing development, or saying if something has been, a red line's been reviewed 3 times, it's automatically approved, things like that. We're still opposed to those, but we're supportive of our counter proposal. Now, what has been important as we've been working on building out that counter proposal has been the survey work that DWS is doing and that we're doing. DWS right now has 7 cities that are not currently working toward compliance with House Bill 462. So 83 cities have to comply, but 7 cities have either not submitted their reports yet, or they received a notice that the report that they submitted was insufficient. So out of 83, currently 7 are in the time frame now to potentially cure. DWS is also gathering data based on what you've submitted around House Bill 462 and moderate income housing plans. On top of that, we are doing our own data gathering to help complete the narrative of what's happening in the housing space. Part of that was in this document that we shared at annual, and hopefully you've been sharing this with legislators. Part of that is additional data we've gathered just in the last 3 weeks. So Carson, I'll give you a moment to walk through the data that we've gathered from this group in the last 3 weeks.
Thanks, Cam, and thank you everybody for coming to LPC today. We've spent a lot of time this summer sending out surveys, following up on surveys, and I really appreciate all the time that you and your staff have gone through to fill these out. What we'll share is kind of a summary of some of the highlights of survey work that we've done this summer. There's one survey we sent in July and one survey we sent in fall. There were some overlapping questions. There was some variation in the surveys. So it's been sort of a hodgepodge as we try to address different questions that come up from different audiences. So I'll just kind of highlight those. If you have questions in the room, just raise your hand. If you have questions in the chat box, I'll try to read those. And yeah, so let's see. So the first thing we want to highlight, we've received responses from 47 cities in total about entitled residential units. This is critical as the market's becoming more chaotic and we have to we'll have permit numbers falling precipitously in the next couple months, so we have to be able to continue to address the fact that local governments are doing the work, are permitting and entitling units, but that just because applicants don't apply for permits doesn't mean that you are not doing your jobs and planning for growth. So we've kind of pivoted a little bit to looking at entitled residential units. Right now, with 47 cities reporting, we have 93,086, which is a huge pipeline considering our sort of deficit per the Gardner Policy Institute is about 31,000. So we're doing good work. We have some more work to go, but we'll continue doing outreach on this number to try to increase it as much as we can and show the most complete picture that's possible. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that we're seeing a pretty clear trend towards smaller homes and smaller lots being entitled and developed. This is consistent with the expectations we've heard from the state. It's probably consistent with what many of you are putting in your moderate income housing plans. So this is, I think, a positive trend towards affordability, at least in theory, with what the city can control. Just because you zone it for smaller lots doesn't actually mean that the value will change, but we're controlling the inputs as we can. You can see the graph there, and that's actually data from the Federal Reserve on entitled lots, but we've seen this anecdotally as well. The next thing that I wanted to mention is we asked again this year, we started doing this research in response to House Bill 374 2 years ago. That was a pretty comprehensive study that we did with your planning departments to try to demonstrate that local governments are meeting statutory plan review timelines. This is a sort of update to that. We specifically were asked about whether local governments are prioritizing commercial development in the application process versus residential. This is, again, a smaller sample size than the research 2 years ago, but it's consistent. And we found that no, in fact, local governments do not appear to be prioritizing commercial developments in that process. In fact, with the typical single-family detached lot, and this is only administrative processes, I should clarify, it's not any development that has legislative changes parallel. What we found is that for a single-family detached lot, you're still looking at about 7.2 days for review. The orange bar there is we asked as well for a typical response length. So that'd be the applicant gets the changes, the red line's back, and then we're looking at about 10 days for them to get back to the city. So we see delays on both ends, and in general, we see bigger delays on the applicant's ends. That could be because a private engineer has to review them or for any number of reasons. But that's sort of what this research is showing. And again, this is the number from House Bill 374. This is much more robust research, but we didn't have an entire summer to do this. And so I think the consistency between the two data points is helpful. Next, for delay reasons, and I'm kind of sharing this as many of you are already aware, but this is what we've gathered to report back to the state. that in general, the biggest reasons for delay are incomplete applications submitted. We've also heard issues about applicants failing to cure deficiencies and non-responsive applicants. So that's really where we're seeing the biggest gap. And that also exacerbates the problem down the line, as many of you know, that if an applicant is slow to respond and then eventually responds, but it may be a month afterwards, your planners will have to go back through, review the initial plans and then the red lines. And so it kind of just creates this whole delay in the pipeline when that happens. Delay trends, these are just a couple examples that we heard. Plans not being stamped by engineers, geotech engineering issues, unresponsive to errors, etc. This is one other thing I wanted to mention. We've heard concern from state leaders that particularly in high growth communities, there's a insistence on single family zoning. We just did some research, and these are numbers from the Quincy Gardner Policy Institute that sort of dispute that actually single family as a share of all residential development in these high growth communities is decreasing at a faster rate than cities at large. In addition to that, we looked at building types permitted, and these are missing middle housing types here on the right. And we've seen that those are generally increasing, particularly in bursts, because you probably won't necessarily have the same number of units every year, just depending on the application volume. So I'll end there. I know it's kind of a quick summary, and we'll keep working towards kind of a final report. These are preliminary numbers, and I don't think anything is new here to any of you, but this is really helpful information as we go back to state leaders and try to dispute some of the incomplete narratives that we're hearing at the legislature. Any questions on the research before I move on to the next hot button issue?
Can you read the sign, please?
Italy Diddly. DIDS is the coolest new acronym at the state capitol right now, unfortunately. Okay, if you have any questions, you can reach out to me, and we'll continue reaching out to city administrators to try to work through the additional data. Thanks.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Carson. You got a sneak peek on that because we're presenting that to the governor's office at 3 o'clock today. And we will be presenting it to House and Senate leadership in the upcoming days. Again, trying to complete the narrative of what's actually happening on the ground at City Hall around planning, because that gets to really what is the problem that we're trying to solve through the Commission on Housing Affordability and through the UEOC. And before we come to the DIDS, this is the grid we've shared at this meeting several times, and again reaffirmed it at the board level this morning. But what is the perceived problem we're trying to solve? The Property Rights Coalition proposal, our concerns with their proposal, then our counter proposal. And again, we went through this at a last couple of LPCs, but we've been trying to get back to what is the underlying issue. So for example, with the timing and role of public input, as well as the timing of local government processes, rather than going down the paths that the PRC has proposed, like making general plans binding or allowing by right development, we've instead proposed improving how local governments do subdivisions. Instead of withholding B and C funds from cities, we've proposed taking the fifth and having a piece of that revenue go to cities based on 462 compliance. Within these category number 4 of local land use process takes too long, you'll see in that bold area data shows city review timing, because we're gathering that data because we would disagree that there's even a problem that needs legislative fixing based on the data that we've been collecting. But again, we'll see how state leaders respond to the data we'll be presenting to them in the days to come. Then on this slide in that section 7 of infrastructure funding, you'll see ULCT counter proposal number 2, DID TBD. And that's because as of a week or so ago, this concept of a different type of PID was still just that. It was just high-level concept, what about this, what about that? And then about a week and a half ago now, we got a little more meat on the bones, but the thing got fleshed out even more last Wednesday. As of last Wednesday, we now actually have a little more information to bring back to this group for consideration, but that's why it was still TBD on the lead counter proposal, because we were waiting for that information. And you can see short-term rentals, economic development incentives, IADUs, annexation, public assets, homelessness, and the like. So with that as the background, the DIDS piece is still TBD. Let's let's talk about what it is. So I'm going to turn it over to Justin to come up and start walk this group through what has been outlined to date. Dave?
For marketing purposes, can we call them developer utilities district, DUDs?
I like that better than Italy Diddly. So for now, the shorthand has always been like this is another type of PID. Our request, just forget that for now. Let's just talk about what this concept is. Speaker Wilson reached out to us a couple weeks ago and said this is something he really wanted us to take a deeper dive on. So we put together a small internal group that's had a couple of conversations about it, including last Wednesday afternoon. And now we'll discuss it with this larger group. And I've got my notes here from that.
Yeah, all right. And Cam and I are going to tag team this one a little bit. It's been one of those issues depending on which meeting, we keep changing who's there. Although I really would like to get Italy Diddly into Utah state law somehow, as that would be great. So that's the challenge right there. That's how we're defining success for this next legislative session. All right. What is a DID? So if you notice on the matrix we had up there a minute ago, the problem that's trying to be solved is infrastructure funding. One of the things we hear, one of the impediments to development is funding the infrastructure. So the DID is in response to this idea of trying to get additional funding for infrastructure. So financing vehicle for developers to fund public infrastructure. Now you'll notice it says conceptually, because although we're getting some more meat on the bones, this is still very much a monster being created in a laboratory. It's not out there going anywhere just yet. And by the way, the name DID just sort of came up one time at a UEOC. We'd been talking about this sort of generally, and then we showed up to UEOC and a slide popped up that said DID, and we all said, oh, that's what we're calling this thing now. So that's where that one came from. So conceptually provides private developers with access to the public bond market. That's what they're going for. That's what they want out of this, is access to the bond market. As opposed to some service districts, DIDs do not have taxing authority. So this is an important distinction between this and PIDs, that we try to avoid saying PIDs because we know that leaves a bad taste in a lot of people's mouth, but for that distinction, that's the big difference. They don't have taxing authority. This doesn't get involved with the mill levy or anything like that. The debt is repaid incrementally upon building permit being issued for a given lot. So when the building permit is issued, that's when it has to be repaid. There's been discussions about doing that at entitlement at other times, but as far as the developers are concerned, that doesn't do anything for them. That doesn't give them any financing they need at that point. So if this was going to go forward, it would be repaid at the time of the building permit. Loan is collateralized with the value of the land and must have consent from 100% of the property owners prior to creation. And if you're sitting there doing the math thinking a developer owns all the land in one area, you are correct. That could just be an owner. It wouldn't necessarily have to be a lot of owners. DIDs do not require municipal approval or creation. So this is a distinguishing factor from a PID. Municipality doesn't have to sign off that this thing gets created. That being said, all of the same development standards, all of the same things you would do for any other development would still apply. They don't just get to go do whatever they want. But a distinguishing factor from a PID is the municipality would not sign off on the creation of this. Must dedicate public infrastructure to the municipality without debt obligations attached. That's one of the things that we have been really firm on. DIDs must abide by municipalities' public improvement standards and normal entitlement process. So that's the basic framework for what we're talking about with the DIDs right now. Before I jump to the next slide, because there's some hairy stuff on the next slide, not that this hasn't been, but any questions or comments about this right now? Yes, Mr. Gruber.
So the basic point is that a developer can borrow money at a lower interest rate. That's why they want this.
That's correct, yeah. The basic point is the developer, to restate that for everyone online, developer can borrow money at a lower interest rate. That is why they want this, yes. Access to the bond market. Other questions or comments? Yeah.
So normally public infrastructure is turned over as soon as it's completed because it's not paid off yet. Mm-hmm. It's not going to be contributed to the city for potentially years.
So Cam, I know you had some discussions on that. Do you want to, what that has looked like in your last meeting?
Yeah.
And I guess the one quick answer I will say is, it all depends. None of this is set yet. We don't have a bill but as discussions have gone right now, there have been discussions around that.
Right, yeah, to Justin's point, that is a very, yeah, that's a very good point. is this is still, yeah, we are. That is still very much a concept form. So the question that was just asked was about when the public entity takes ownership of the infrastructure, right? So if a development is built over a 10-year period of time, would the infrastructure ever be encumbered with this potential debt? And the back and forth that we've had in the internal discussions thus far has been that we would be concerned if that infrastructure was encumbered going forward. So the infrastructure would have to be free and clear of the encumbrances. The encumbrances would run with the lots. Remember?
How would this limit the city's ability to bond on other items?
It wouldn't. So this would be independent of the city balance sheet.
So the question there is, how would this encumber the city, or how would it affect the city's ability to bond? And the answer is it wouldn't. Let's go back here.
Confirmed with sort of independent bond attorneys that this proposal would be able to access the public bond market if the infrastructure itself is not dedicated to the public for some time.
Sorry, can you repeat that one more time? We just had a quick sidebar.
Essentially, has bond counsel confirmed that the eventuality of this being public infrastructure would enable them to access public bond markets upfront?
So you had the most recent meeting on that one. I can tell you what they said a couple weeks ago, but
Yeah, as Justin and I said, like, he and I have been in like handing off meetings. We haven't both been on the same meeting here. So that question came up at our last meeting, and the answer is still TBD. It's important to note that this type of tool doesn't really exist anywhere. So this is really thinking outside the box. And the reason I think it's important for us to consider it, not saying we have to support it at this point yet, but just kind of consider the problem it's trying to solve, is there are a lot of areas where the choke point to getting those 93,000 housing units built is the infrastructure, whether it's sewer infrastructure, water infrastructure, and the like. So we brought that point up repeatedly over the course of the UEOC this summer. And so this is an effort by some of the private sector to say, yep, we agree with you that infrastructure is a choke point. But cities are not adopting PIDs or other existing tools at the rate that some of them would like to see. So they say, well, what if we came up with another tool that still preserved your local control over the engineering standards, the infrastructure standards, locations, all of that, didn't affect your property taxpayers, but also allowed us to get the infrastructure built faster and therefore opens up more units to development. So that's really the underlying problem they were trying to solve when this brainstorm came up. Coming back to Jennifer's question, like that is one of the key sticking points, and we just don't have an answer yet for it for sure. Again, because this is a new tool. Ken?
So would cities continue to be able to charge impact fees, or would we go through some analysis in this case?
Yeah, so that came up in last week's conversation too, and that also is still to be determined is what the impact would be on impact fees. Oh, yeah, Carson wrote that question. So our intent today was just to fill in some gaps, because this is a term that came up at the UEOC. The UEOC actually endorsed the 3-line concept of we should look at something like this. That's more or less what it said, right, Mayor Ramsey? We should look at something like this. Now, in the last few days, we've got a little more context. So mainly we wanted a chance for this group to say, have you thought about this? Have you thought about this? Have you thought about this? And then we're not in a position yet to say yay or nay, but will be soon. So if there are other policy considerations or thoughts that anybody in this group wants to bring them up now so that we can work them into the conversation.
Just kind of thinking through it, and this is the first I've heard of it, so you would have to have the dedication of the infrastructure on plat. It just won't work otherwise. And so you'd have to have whoever the lien holder is, the bondholder, agree to that dedication, because you can't have it where you lose your public infrastructure or something. You don't have it when people buy bonds.
Yeah, so the point here that Craig raised was back to the timing of when the encumbrance on the lot versus the development of the infrastructure and what gets deeded to the city at what time, or to the local government at what time.
It's on the law.
Yep, well,
You
and,
would have to dedicate the improvements because you can't have a plat of them.
yeah, well, and yeah, that's the sequencing piece, is when it gets dedicated. You could see a scenario where subdivision moves forward, the infrastructure gets deeded to the local government, even though lots are still being sold over a period of time, and the money that is paying off the bond from those lots is still moving forward, but the infrastructure's already built and moved on.
You just can't, I don't think you mix the two. It's
No.
just getting cities in trouble.
No,
All right, there's one online there. This would be a good one to work with UAC on, as it seems like more of an issue in unincorporated areas of development. And yes, we're talking UAC about it, trying to get them involved in looking at this as well.
yeah, and Ty, this came up in our call last week. Hold on, let's see. So, Ty, we actually asked this question last week too, about where this would take effect in unincorporated areas, and we referenced Olympia Hills and other similar developments, and what the scenario would be if a property owner could do a did over here in an unincorporated area, but expect that the city at some point is going to annex it. Again, that's also an unresolved issue, but it's something that we've talked about. Question about utilities, would utilities easements come with infrastructure? Yes, we talked about the easement piece last week, as well as how that intersects. And then Matt said Emily opposed losing local control to authorize use of DIDs PIDs. So that is one of the tricky pieces here, is you'd still have the local control to authorize PIDs, but what they're proposing is a new type of tool that would not have the local control in the sense that the city authorizes it, but would still have to meet all of the city infrastructure standards and be consistent with those city infrastructure standards. So probably are going to go out and build infrastructure and deed it to the city if it didn't fit with the city's master plan and with the city's infrastructure plan. So there still is some local control, it's just not the authorization like you have with the PID. So as we've said, a lot of moving pieces, but we just wanted to get it on the radar, and then if people have questions or thoughts, you can let us know, because this is one where it was kind of under the radar for a few months, and then the last couple of weeks has gone from here to there in terms of priority of key folks at the Capitol.
And John, before calling, yeah, and that is important. It was sort of out there conceptually and very vague for many months, and then out of nowhere. Well, not really out of nowhere. We got close to the deadline, and they said we should probably turn in our homework. Is what really happened. Is we started seeing some meat comes on the bones, and then, like Cam mentioned, the speaker has become personally interested in this. He's shown up to work meetings, and if you've ever been in a work meeting, or if you've even been in a committee meeting at the Capitol, you don't see the speaker and the president show up very often. So when the speaker shows up to a work meeting, that tells us something about how important he sees this as. So this is something we've got to engage on, and we've got to figure out. If we don't get to yes, we don't get to yes, and that's fine. If we can't find ways around this, that's where we'll land. But also politically, we need to understand how important this is to the speaker. So John, you had a question or comment?
And this is probably TBD, I'll be very quick. Do we know from bond council, does this qualify for that discount? Does nobody afford to a public sector entity?
So the question is, do we know from bond council whether this qualifies for that discount? That's a TBD, yeah. There's a lot of questions from different bond councils that we need to get some information on. Carson?
No, not yet. We'll just stay with these questions for now. So the other thing I'll add on the bond council, John, is there have been several bond attorneys who've been involved in the small work group over the last couple of weeks. So Matt Dias, circumventing local taxing authority will seriously impair cities and towns' future ability to raise, levy, proper process, truth, and taxation. A key distinction here between a PID that relies on property tax and whatever we want to call it, for now a DID, is a DID does not rely on property tax. There is no property tax associated with it. So that was our number one issue actually on PIDs before, is we wanted to make sure there was the local government as the gatekeeper because of the property tax. In this case, they're saying, okay, if we don't use property tax, and does there still need to be that gatekeeper role? So in this case, there would not be the impact on property tax. And then there was a longer comment about escrow. So Brandon's comment about the debt obligations may not be passed onto a city, but long-term liabilities. And can the city escrow for the cost of the infrastructure? Yep, that was something we were talking about last week. So the good news is, Justin, every issue that's come up in kind of the broader group is consistent with all the issues that have come up in the smaller group. So that's,
The
you know,
good
that's
news is
to
there's
hear.
lots of issues.
That, but there's also, yeah, the fact is we haven't heard anything today that's different than what we've heard before that we've been trying to troubleshoot.
Right.
Craig?
Ask another question. Has
Until Craig asks the question.
financial advisor's been involved in, yeah. One question is, yeah, does a bond attorney say it's legal and can be done? Another question is this something you can market on the individual?
That's a great question. So the question is, has bond counsel weighed in on, you know, whether or not it's legal, and is this something you can even market? And that's a great question. We've asked that question. I don't know that we've gotten a good answer to it, but that one's been floated as well. But it's a great question whether or not anyone will actually want to pick these bonds up. Yeah.
So this is just my first impression, but of all of the things we've talked about over the months and years, we've been talking about ways to impact home prices. This could impact home prices more than most of the strategies we've talked about. And if there's a way we can solve some of these problems so that we can all feel comfortable, this seems like really good thinking to me. That's just my opinion.
So what Ken from North Salt Lake said is, of all the different ideas that have come up this year around addressing the homeless, that was from this morning, the housing
That's
challenges.
later. We've got another slide on
that. But the housing challenges, this feels like a way that actually is addressing both the need on the infrastructure and driving down the price of development, which hopefully also addresses the cost at the end for a home builder. In many ways, when they presented this to us a couple weeks ago, our response was, we've been saying all along we need more infrastructure tools. And rightly or wrongly, this was an idea on the infrastructure tool side. So still a lot of unanswered questions, but it was an idea on the infrastructure side. So that's a great point. Brandon, the future lot owners are responsible to pay off the bond. Yes, it would operate similar to like an assessment that would need to be paid off at a certain trigger point, but it would not pass along to multiple homeowners down the line. At least that's been the general concept. Mayor Tran?
I have a question. So I appreciate the fact that it would help development, it would help infrastructure, but is there a way to hold them so that there's an accountability so that when the homes become built or the housing becomes available, that savings or that discount or that value is passed on to buyers? Or will they just keep raising the prices and that is high and it doesn't actually help?
So it's an excellent point that Mayor Tran just raised. So to repeat for those online, it dovetails with what Ken Leatham just said a moment ago, that one of the intriguing concepts here is that it could bring down the cost of developing the infrastructure. So is there a way to ensure that some of that benefit accrues to the actual home buyer down the line? That makes a lot of sense. And in a way, you could see how we could follow a model similar to the HTRZ from a couple of years ago, where the HTRZ said, here's the outcome we're driving towards. And everybody's got a little bit of skin in the game to get to that outcome. But once you hit that threshold, then these pieces apply, right? So you could say, okay, the criteria for when a DID can be created has to have certain affordability thresholds or owner-occupied thresholds to it, that then means everybody's benefiting from the use of that tool. So that's a very, very intriguing concept. And even Matt Dixon was nodding his head.
Mayor, is there anything you want to say about the ULCT? Because this one will come up.
Well, I'm wondering if.
Do you want to come?
Are we on? Yeah.
So we did vote yes on this, with a caveat that we needed a lot more information. We had essentially a sentence, maybe two sentences put together as the initial framework. So this is starting to come together. We are getting more information. Are we expecting a formal vote on this at the next UEOC?
I've been texting with Kyle today, so yeah, Mayor Ramsey just gave me this look of like, what am I voting on next week? The answer is to be determined, and that's not a cop-out. That's legitimately, there's the meeting last Wednesday afternoon. We put together a list of questions we're working on answers, so they were trying to put together like a Q&A sheet. I'd asked for it to be ready by today, it's just not ready. So that's why, like, I've got a Google Doc there of things that were going back and forth. We were trying to get answers to these questions. I don't know if there'll be anything more formal ready for next week, but I reserve the right to change that statement over the next few days. The good news is you and I will be at the National League of Cities conference together later this week, so we'll have more info by then. But for purposes of this group, knowing that things were moving and we may have even more flesh on the bones between now and the next time this group meets in mid-December, that's why we thought it was important to bring up the concepts at a high level and to get your general thoughts as we proceed with the dialogue without taking a formal position yet.
Yep, and I appreciate the feedback exactly for that reason, because there's a lot of moving parts that still need to be filled in between now and then, and likely will be before we get the chance to even visit all together as a group again. And I do think that your question, Mayor Tran, is key. Is this a tool to help get infrastructure in that costs less for the developers? Is it going to be a tool that generates additional revenue on each home that they are building and selling? Or is this a tool toward housing affordability? And is some of that difference going to be passed on to the homeowner in the end? It's a question that I think we'll continue to ask and make really clear that we need to know. What's the end goal of this? Yes, it can get infrastructure in, at a lower rate. For who? Right? And to what end? Where's the benefit lie in that? So we'll keep having this conversation. I want to think, thanks for your input, and we'll just keep trying to flush this out. Yeah, thanks.
Perfect, thanks, Mayor. There's a question from Matt Dietz about what did be accessible for commercial development that includes little or no housing for primary residential. That came up last week too, is this residential development or not? And one of the comments actually from one of our people in that group was we didn't want to necessarily preclude a financing tool from facilitating a mixed-use development or something that isn't just primarily residential. So yet another TBD, but yeah, good question. And then Councilmember Wylock from West Jordan said, it seems like something we could support, but the devil's in the details. Yeah, again, we're not asking for a position today, but Mayor Zoltansky.
I think to qualify a commitment for a percentage of affordability or some metrics of affordability, yeah, I would welcome this as a new tool. So if it can help the developers move faster and maybe bridge a gap, for funding, then that would make sense, as long as it ends up in public deeded infrastructure in the end.
Can I repeat that for folks on?
So yeah, Mayor Zoltansky just mentioned that if there was some way that this could lead to having, I think you said a percentage of affordable housing, or that would get passed on so that we'd have some more affordability, this is something we should take a serious look at and could potentially support. Did I capture it? Yes. All right. And I will note to Mayor Ramsey's point, last year, if you roll back a year, you probably remember us talking about retail incentives nonstop, as that was for us one of the big votes that was coming up in the UEOC. And Mayor Ramsey took the lone no vote in the UEOC, fell on her sword on that one. And then we still negotiated almost daily on retail incentives through all of December, January, and most of February. So just because the UEOC is going to do something with this next week doesn't mean, of course, the conversation is done. I expect this is one we will keep talking about because there are so many details that need to be hammered out on this one. Even if we all get to a point where we're comfortable with the concept, there are a lot of questions from bond attorneys and other things that we need to nail down before we could see this as a viable option. Just trying to work out all those details. So there's plenty left to discuss on this one.
Speaking of questions, Brandon Bell asked a question about the payment for the debt obligation, and we will be, because I don't have an answer for you on this one, Brandon, and so congrats, that is a brand new question that hasn't come up yet, so we'll be copy and pasting, well, I say we, Carson, you'll be copy and pasting, right, all the questions out of here, perfect, so we can funnel them through our work group and then bring it back to the league board or LPC for future consideration when we're ready to take a position. Okay. Anything else? Well, then let me, Carson, I know there are other DID slides, but we're just going to skip past those because this was really the main thing we wanted to hit on. There we go. Okay. So again, this grid is perceived problem, the PRC proposal, league concerns, the PRC proposals, and then the league counter proposal. I guess for fear of consuming the rest of the meeting, are there any final questions about what happened at the CHA last week, or what may be going to the UEOC next week, or any of the moving pieces within the UEOC and the housing space? I mean, it's a incredibly vague and loaded question all at the same time, but Mr. Hiskey.
Kim, I listened to the presentation and really commend the mayor and yourself, also Mayor Silvestrini, the presentation you made when contrasted with the PRC. There's a lot of anecdote, anecdotal references to this. You folks gave facts, as was just stated. There's some timeliness and arguments. You made use of that data, and I commend you for and looking at real political realities, you know, where leadership is being considered. I agree with that.
Well, thank you, John. And what John Hiskey was referencing is that Mayor Silvestrini and I presented to the Commission on Housing Affordability last week. They gave us 10 minutes. We squeezed 30 minutes of stuff into 10 minutes. Okay, no, we went for 30. But I did have my phone. Yeah, I did have my phone up front with the timer, and we tried, but between the questions and just all the material we were trying to get out, we went for 30. And that's in part why they did the vague motion at the end, is because they had the PRC list, our list, and realized they just didn't have time to fully deliberate, so they moved it on to the co-chairs. This is also an important time, though, to reference the work that many of you have been doing with those co-chairs. Senator Fillmore, for example, is in his first year as a co-chair. He represents the southwest part of Salt Lake County. Mayor Ramsey has met with Senator Fillmore. I know West Jordan's been in communication with Senator Fillmore, and Senator Fillmore has been responsive, doesn't always agree with what we have to say, but he's been responsive to the arguments we've made to him and the data that we've brought to him. Likewise, Representative Steve Waldrop has been the co-chair, and he is now officially a lame duck because he didn't run for re-election and will be leaving the legislature at the end of the year. But he's continued to be responsive to the communities up north. His replacement, Representative Stephen White, has held 2 meetings in the last month with Springville, Mapleton, Spanish Fork, Orem, and Provo. So thank you. We have a couple league board members, Councilmember Malkovich from Woodland Hills, I guess Woodland Hills, so it'd be 6 cities. Councilmember Malkovich, Councilmember Egbert, Mayor Kafusi, 3 board members who've met with Representative White, and then we've joined him as staff. Again, he's been very responsive to our arguments and our points and our data. Doesn't always agree, but very responsive. So we've been working hard to make sure that the doors are open and that we're at the table for the dialogue. Where it goes from here is still up in the air, so stay tuned. We'll be working closely with Mayor Ramsey so that she's ready for next week, but still a lot of moving parts. So with that, thank you for the kind words, John, about the presentation last week. Are there any other questions about UEOC, CHA, and other housing pieces? Matt?
Cameron, is this the time to touch on short-term rentals?
Sure.
What's being discussed? Can you just give us a quick update?
You betcha. So short-term rentals are on my handy-dandy grid here. Okay, so short-term rentals is perceived problem number 9, and we've had a significant battle back and forth over whether or not short-term rentals are even a problem that needs to be addressed. So there have been some who've said cities are actually causing the problem with short-term rentals by not allowing more of them, or cities are overregulating, or cities aren't allowing for other types of housing, which then means that as short-term rentals come in, it's the city zoning that's exacerbating the housing problem that short-term rentals are contributing to, not short-term rentals causing that problem. Meanwhile, we've pushed back to say short-term rentals are competing for housing stock, not in every community, but particularly in our destination communities. We've shared the Gardner policy data, and then we've made the arguments about equity with businesses, lodging establishments and the like, as well as just the negative impacts on a neighborhood when you have homes that yesterday are lived in by full-time residents and tomorrow are now short-term rentals. To the credit of Representative Cal Musselman, who has been spearheading this issue, he has worked diligently to create the space for the PRC, well, it's not even the PRC, but for those on the pro side of short-term rentals to make their argument and for local government to make our argument. And we've tried to nuance it based on the resolution that you endorsed back in the fall, that we're not anti-short-term rentals, we're pro finding the balance of where short-term rentals are appropriate. And so Representative Musselman had his last stakeholder group meeting 2 weeks ago and is now in the process of drafting language. There is very little appetite to repeal the so-called not well language. That's the language from 7 years ago that precludes a city from being able to enforce an ordinance that prohibits the use of a short-term rental or the rental or the advertisement of a short-term rental simply based on the advertisement alone. Representative Musselman is open to clarifying how the ad actually can be used as evidence for zoning violations or for nuisances. And the reason this is important, I see the Salt Lake contingent in the back. Salt Lake City is actually involved in active litigation right now where Salt Lake City brought an enforcement action against a property owner who was renting a short-term rental illegally. Salt Lake City is using the ad as a piece of evidence, but not the exclusive evidence. The property owner sued the city to say, based on that so-called not well language, the city can't even use it as evidence. And Representative Musselman, to his credit, has said, no, I think the intent always was that you could use it as evidence. It just can't be the sole evidence. So he was willing to make some clarifications there. We've talked about additional revenue streams for local governments to be able to mitigate the negative impacts of short-term rentals. That's still up in the air a little bit. We've talked about clarifying how code enforcement can operate. That piece is still up in the air. But these have been they've been extremely difficult negotiations back and forth. But to Representative Musselman's credit, he's tried to bring stakeholders together, and he has decided not to go forward with a committee bill. So that gives you a sense of how divided he thinks people are on this issue, that he was hoping it would be a committee bill. He's now decided not to go the committee bill route, but still wants to run a bill to at the very least clarify the not well language and make some other tweaks. So Carson, did I miss any other big pieces from our short-term rental meetings? I don't have my notes in front of me. Yes, I did miss something. Sales tax requirements. I should have looked down at my notes. So number 2 and number 3, that's the other piece where Representative Musselman has consistently said short-term rentals are businesses, they should act like businesses, and we should figure out a way to get to that equity between a traditional lodging establishment like a hotel and a short-term rental. Where that gets a little tricky is you may have a short-term rental that's operating in a zone that doesn't allow for it. Well, that short-term rental can't get a business license because they're operating in an area where they're not allowed. So one of the proposals that was on the table initially was to allow them by right under state law, similar to what happened with internal ADUs in a portion of the city, and then be able to require business license, require being up to code and other things. And we said no to the by right in state law. And so there'd be no to that. Well, that in turn does make it complicated to get to the full equity, but he's considering some potential requirements around state sales tax ID numbers to, again, address that equity and make sure that even though short-term rentals are still collecting and remitting taxes the same way a hotel or a motel or other lodging establishment is. So that's the other piece that'll likely be in the bill, but again, it's up in the air where it'll go. Evelyn?
Could we solve a lot of these problems if, Airbnb or all of these sites required, some sort of a license before you can even set up an account, or required your tax ID number? I mean, it seems like we could solve all of those problems by just making it so that you couldn't even list your short-term rental unless you're licensed. So just comment on a lot of other.
Yeah, in fact, so Evelyn's point is, can you solve a lot of this problem if you mandated that a platform like Airbnb could only list your site if you were properly licensed and in compliance with zoning, right? There have been states that have looked into that. As you can imagine, the platforms are anxious about that sort of mandate. They argue that they don't have the ability to enforce compliance down to that level. Right. Yeah, so in fact, we actually discussed in the last stakeholder meeting language that came from Michigan, and it's called the Platform Accountability Act, right? Is that what it's called, Carson, the Platform Accountability Act? And there were several pieces in that act, including what you just described, but it met into significant opposition from those on the other side. That's where I think what is likely is we'll end up with that state sales tax requirement. But there's still a lot of uncertainty about what the platforms are required to do versus what an owner is required to do, even under current law right now. Mayor?
That's how eBay sales started out, just individual sellers. Now everything is taxed and shipping and everything is collected.
Yep.
Whether you want it or not. So it's, regardless of the licensing and the permitting, if there's a transaction that those big platforms are handling, just like we do for eBay and Amazon, we just collect the sales tax and send it to the states.
Yep, and all that's true. So what Mayor Zoltensky was saying, this is similar to how eBay started out. So you could have that sort of affirmative obligation on the platforms. The outcome that it would result in would be current illegal short-term rentals that are operating not just without a license but without zoning approval would not be able to advertise on Airbnb anymore. Which, from a city perspective, we would say they're illegal. They shouldn't be allowed to advertise. And what we had actually proposed as a counter to the buy right concept was essentially a safe harbor window of time where, I'll use Sandy since you guys brought it up, if Sandy wasn't allowing short-term rentals in this particular area, but there were some that were operating illegally, there'd be a safe harbor period of time where they could essentially petition the city to allow it in the zone. Recognizing that at the end of the day, the city may still say no, but now this business owner's been outed and would be subject to the enforcement. And that was poorly received because they felt like it was just another way at essentially prohibiting these short-term rentals and regulating them out of business. So that's really where the rub is we want the ability to zone and be able to enforce our zoning because they're existing in areas where they're not allowed. Those on the other side want them to have a meaningful way to continue operating. And we have not been able to crack the code about how to bring those two pieces, or how to align those two pieces. I thought I saw a hand over here. Councilmember Bradshaw.
My comment was going to be along the same lines as Mayor Zoltansky's, only start here about that's it. I spent 5 years of my life working on online sales tax issues and platforms with the inability to comply with millions of transactions happen every day where they're able to calculate the appropriate sales tax, remit it, track the package to your door in real time. So I do think pushing perhaps in conjunction with other states on the platforms needs to be where this goes. I think it's unrealistic for the consumer for short-term rental to be able to know. Yep. In full disclosure, I'm going to stay in a short-term rental over the Thanksgiving holiday. I have no way of knowing. I dearly hope, and we will be the best guess, that this house that we're going to stay at is compliant with the codes of that municipality. But I don't have any way of knowing as the person using the platform. They have all of the tools to know that in a much more streamlined way, and perhaps we need to make it something that is pushed in conjunction with other means in other cities or other states, because I think that is the easiest and simplest way for everyone to know that where they're staying complies with the local ordinances, and they're properly receiving the taxes I fully intend to pay on stay.
Yep. Yep, exactly. So what Councilmember Bradshaw says is in her professional life, she was heavily involved on the online sales tax collection and remittance and requiring platforms like an Amazon or an eBay to collect and remit sales taxes. And so, again, there's a logical connection to having those same obligations on platforms because it's hard for a consumer to know if you're staying in a short-term rental, if it's in compliance with local zoning or not. And that's all accurate. Where we're butting heads is just the fundamental issue of should units that right now are operating in areas where they're not allowed, should we have more ability, whether it's through platform accountability or local zoning or other ways, to regulate those units or not? And that's really where the rub is, and will continue to be. Okay. Any other final questions on UEOC CHA-related stuff? Dave?
Are you going to go over gravel pits?
I'm not, thankfully.
Somebody please.
Yes. Okay, that's my cue. Justin.
I'm not going over gravel pits either. There's no way. The quick update on gravel pits. There will almost certainly be a bill on gravel pits. We don't know what that looks like yet. There have been cities, and we're going to go, I think they called it the pit crew from a few years ago, that talked about gravel pits. As soon as we start getting some more information about what that looks like, we will get that group back together to talk more in depth about whatever proposal is coming up. Senator Sandel has said he's going to be running something on gravel pits. Don't know exactly what that looks like yet. He's been telling me for the last 2 months that he's going to show me some language, and I haven't seen anything yet. So as soon as we get something, we'll promulgate it out there. We'll get the crew together, and we can talk about what that looks like. But we will have some discussions coming up on that one. So sorry I don't have anything more than that, but that's what's coming up on gravel pits. Oh, God, hit this button. All right. There we go. All right, let's talk about another really easy issue. Let's talk about water, property tax and water. I know, looking out this window at the snow up on the mountains, they should really do all the drought issues in the summer when we're all feeling it, but or maybe they shouldn't. But property tax and water. So the language you see on the board here is the language that presented last month during interim. The good news is this is not the language we expect to see coming up. This bill was heard in the Rev and Tax Committee on interim day. There was significant pushback from several stakeholders. We got up and voiced opposition to it, as well as Prep 60 and others. The problem that is trying to be solved is basically there are some entities that are not paying property tax. Therefore, public schools, universities, churches aren't paying property tax, and therefore may not be paying their fair share of the cost of water that others are paying through property tax plus fees. And so this bill suggested that you couldn't use property tax at all to pay for water infrastructure, basically is what it boils down to. Yes, I said boils down to on a water bill. But it wasn't on purpose, but it came out anyway. But with the pushback, Senator McKay, who's running this bill, has pulled back from this proposition, and instead has talked to several stakeholders. And we're going to be looking at this issue more in depth. We haven't seen bill language yet, so this could change before Wednesday. I just checked right before I stood up to make sure there wasn't anything out there yet. But what I'm hearing right now is the most likely scenario is there's a group put together to study this over the next year or 2 years, whatever that may look like. We'll make sure that we have someone on that study committee so that we're a part of that. So what could have been a long discussion is going to be a quick discussion for right now. We'll see if that's what we see on Wednesday, obviously see what comes up and finally is voted on in the legislative session. But right now, as far as property tax and water goes, the likely scenario is we'll have some kind of study item on this that looks at this more in depth. So coming up, any questions on that one? If anyone would really, really love to be the league's representative on any not yet voted on study committee, please let us know. The other one is per capita consumptive use. There is bill language out on this one. I put this bill language up, but basically, you may have heard over and over, this gets quoted in the news all the time, that Utahns use more water per capita than anyone else in the country, more than Nevada, more than Arizona, even though we're the second driest state. A lot of that actually comes from how we calculate water usage. If you look at how Nevada, for example, is calculating their water usage, they look at how much water they're pulling out, and then they subtract from that the amount of water that goes back into the system. So most of you probably know this, but about 90% of the water we use indoors goes back into the system. That water isn't lost. If it's on our lawns, less, we're using more of that. But water that gets used indoor, about 90% of that goes back into the system. So if you're in Nevada and you're calculating how much water you're using, you're pulling out water, and then if it's indoor, 90% of that water goes back in and they're subtracting that. So what this bill basically does with a whole lot of really specific language is trying to look at ways that we calculate our water a little bit differently. So when the state engineer sets standards for how this water gets reported up from the different conservancy districts, that's who's reporting most of this up, there will be a change in how that is reported that will go into place over the next few years. And part of that is so we have a little bit more accurate reading. Part of that is so you can't go out and say, we're using more water than everybody else. We're just going to be on a more level playing field with how that water usage is calculated. So not necessarily anything that we need to take a huge position on, nothing that we have to have a big discussion on, but just want to make you aware of that. Oh, that's good. Whose bill is this? This was brought, Mike McKell. Mike McKell's the one who's sponsoring this bill. If you've never been a part of water legislation, this is what I learned in the last year. You have to go in front of like 100 different committees before your bill goes anywhere. Okay, it's like 4, but still. There's the Utah Water Commission that runs out of the Division of Natural Resources. You've got to go take a bill there, and they've got to talk about it. And then most of those same guys are on the Utah Water Development Commission, which is a legislative commission, and you've got to go take it there and get them to sign off on it. And then, and only then, once these water gods have signed off on it, can you actually take it to a legislative committee to get voted on. Water buffaloes, I'm going to call them water gods. So if the water buffaloes were gods, they would be buffalo gods. Like in Black Panther, how they're all panthers, these would be buffaloes. Or bison, probably, here in this state. But anyway, this bill has moved through those pieces. It will continue moving forward. There's some really technical stuff in here that needs to get worked out, I'm aware of. But if you hear per capita consumptive use, that's the bill that we're talking about here. So any comments that aren't snarky from Bountiful Council members? If only this happened in your house and nowhere else. I have no room to speak, though. I'm the worst. All right, so we have a few other quick items we want to talk about. Rachel Terry's going to come talk about Your Land, Your Plan. Cam's going to do a quick update on business licensing. Molly's going to solve homelessness in 2 minutes or less. And then also talk about recruitment and retention.
So Intermountain Healthcare and Zions Bank have sponsored a program called Your Land, Your Plan. They gave us a grant so that we could hire national experts in public assets. What does public assets mean? It's land that's owned within your city, that your city owns, but it could also mean land owned by a county, by any nonprofit like Intermountain Healthcare. How do you use it to generate additional revenue? So for example, let's say you wanted to update your main street. You own this little piece of property. Do you just sell it? Or can you do a long-term lease so there's long-term revenue going to your city? Can you use it to connect other parks and use it to connect other trails? How do you use that land and build it into your overall goals? So we are working with Urban 3 in Strong Towns, Chuck Marone, who you may have met if you went to the conference. They are developing a curriculum. Our first one, we've done a couple of webinars and other things, but on January 9th is when we're doing our first major workshop. If you go online to our events tab, Your Land, Your Plan, this particular workshop is geared towards our elected officials, but also our city managers and staff, but that's where it's geared. Like, what's the overall vision? What are you supposed to think about? How do you do it? Then there'll be workshops around the state that are really technical, that get into the weeds of how do you do this? How do you identify the land? How do you use it? How do you integrate it into your overall goals? And those dates will be coming out. So we hope that you'll sign up yourselves and that you will encourage your staff members, your electeds, to sign up and participate in these workshops. And then there'll be some additional resources that follow from the workshops that we're working on now. So you can register on our website. That's all mine. So I've solved public assets and Molly's going to do homelessness.
Hello, coming to you at my usual spot of right as the meeting's supposed to end to discuss easy, solvable issues. With homelessness, the board approved some general guiding principles for our negotiations as we work with the legislative leadership and Wayne Niederhauser to craft a new plan for HB 440 and ideally begin to look at homelessness through a more statewide lens. Additionally, I'll just hit both right now. Our Utah Foundation's report on public safety recruitment and retention is out. We will be posting that on our website. We will also be posting the homelessness guiding principles on our website. So take a look at those, and I won't take more of your time because I know we're out of it.
No, we start at 12:15, so we still have 15 more minutes. So
the agenda said 1:30.
1:45.
Oh, well, the agenda lied.
It says 1:30. Well, will you just hit the homelessness principles?
Sure, yeah, I will. Justin, is that on
I've got one right here.
to display? Yeah. Perfect, thanks, Kim. So largely the way that we have decided to craft these principles with the board approval is because as we went through the process this year, it became very clear that the goalposts and goals for this issue were ever evolving and kind of shifting as we were going through the process, so that we were never really in a position for success or to kind of achieve the goals that the state set out. So part of the reason why we came up with these principles rather than actual policy solutions is because we don't know what those goalposts are. And so we don't know what to frame our policy solutions as. So until we get those goalposts, we are looking at these three kind of guiding principles with some sub-principles within. So first, as we look at the HB 440 replacement, we want to see what both the short and long-term solutions are. So with that, the primary question is that we need to establish whether our efforts are to solve homelessness or to mitigate homelessness as cities. We really need that question answered before we can make a lot of policy recommendations. Additionally, we think that all stakeholders, including OHS, cities, service providers, public safety, residents, and individuals experiencing homelessness need to agree on what the short-term and long-term goalposts are. And that should include a need for, if it should include a need for a permanent overflow facility or a temporary one, the number of necessary beds, the role of on-site services and the hours of operation, if we need a new facility entirely or if we can retrofit an existing facility, the role of core cities within Salt Lake County and other cities within Salt Lake County and beyond. We also want to balance community public safety along with homeless individuals' needs and service providers' needs and outcomes. And we also want to recognize that there is a possible need for more facilities, which could include things like permanent supportive housing, overflow facilities, homeless resource centers, regulated camping, and more. The second overarching theme is that we want to really examine the role of cities when we're talking about homelessness. Homelessness is a statewide problem, and the state and all regions need to participate in the solutions, particularly our urban areas. We want to collaborate with OHS to establish metrics about public safety mitigation, permanent supportive housing locations, and other relevant data points among jurisdictions so that we can fairly analyze outcomes throughout various jurisdictions. And we want to collaborate with OHS to provide incentives for local governments to participate in long-term solutions. That could include increased financial contributions to the mitigation fund, qualifying mitigation offsets for cities that do things like zone for permanent supportive housing, domestic violence shelters, or other qualifying facilities. And then finally, we really need to revisit the mitigation fund. The mitigation fund should not subsidize the operation of facilities, which is what we're seeing a trend towards. We really need to have mitigation and operations be independently funded from one another. Public safety, additionally, cities with homeless resource centers should be reimbursed for most of their direct and indirect public safety costs as identified by the key metrics. And finally, the mitigation fund should include state and local dollars and should increase as needs increase, preferably with new revenue options. So that's the kind of general framework that the board adopted. We'll post these all online, and as Cam and I head into these negotiations, please be in touch with us if you have questions or ideas as we try to solve this thing.
No pressure.
Yeah, we're good.
Solve it.
Perfect, thank you, Molly, and thank you to the League Board. We had a really phenomenal discussion this morning at the League Board meeting as we were putting together that framework, so that now as we're negotiating the different key pieces, we can refer back to that as our rules of engagement on it. But stay tuned. One thing that we drove home to the board this morning is every city in this room contributes to the mitigation fund. The state of Utah now contributes to the mitigation fund. And right now, some of that money is being used for operations rather than mitigation. So at the very least, we've got to solve that issue, while also recognizing that the cities that house homeless resource centers and other similar facilities, they are still subsidizing the public safety needs in their communities above and beyond what the mitigation fund covers. So lots of moving parts there. Okay, the last two items we need to hit today, one is on business licenses, the other's on transportation. And Andrew Gruber is smiling back there because he's very excited whenever we use the word transportation in a public meeting. So first, just for that, I'm going to do the business license piece first. Representative Tusher has a bill file open. We got this question, and honestly, we just need your help to try to answer it. So the question is this. There are some cities that require, as part of your local business license, for a city or for a business to have a sales tax ID number and file the sales tax return, even if that company is in an industry that's never had sales tax, which basically means they're filing a $0 amount as part of that filing. So Representative Tusher said he feels like this is an unnecessary requirement in local business licenses and would like to just basically run a bill saying cities can't require that sales tax ID and the sales tax filing if your company doesn't engage in sales tax. So from kind of a high-level principle perspective, we don't like when the state, we usually oppose when the state micromanages local government processes. On the other hand, we really are just looking for some feedback if there are policy reasons why in a local business license, a city would require that filing even if the company has no engagement with sales tax.
So this imagines that the legislature never reconsidered sales tax on services?
Interesting point that Kate just brought up about sales tax on services. That's not actually a snippy comment. That's just a very well played one about sales tax on services. So that, yeah, that's a fair point.
Who do you want the research to go to?
This one, have it go to Justin, even though he made me come up and do it.
I don't think the state can impose a state requirement. Cities cannot impose a return.
True, but based on what legislative research has told us, there are some business licenses that are requiring that.
I understand that.
Yeah.
I'm saying that that's
Right.
province of the cities.
Yeah. Mayor Burton?
As a business who provides the service that does not need a sales tax number, I would be upset as a business if that was required of me when I got my business license in the city.
Yeah. Mayor Burton, for those online, Mayor Burton said if he were a business owner and was required to have that sales tax ID number and file, even though your business doesn't collect or remit sales tax, would be annoyed by that additional burden. Okay, based on the room, I can see, people are captivated by this topic, but if you have additional thoughts, let us know so we can get back to ledge research and Representative Tusher. We'll also follow up with the business license administration. But this is an interesting one where like our policy principles collide with something that may not be a fight worth fighting. But if you come up with other thoughts, let us know. Last thing, oh good, it's up there. I've spent most of my life this summer in I'm coming to transportation, Andrew, don't you worry. But I've spent most of my time in the UEOC space. Yes, it's been, right, getting the gang back together. Justin has spent time in both the UEOC and interim meetings. And we've told you on several occasions that interims have been pretty quiet, all things considered. Well, this is a snapshot of an interim committee meeting in 2 days. Committee business, that one doesn't count. So 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So basically 10 draft bills, most of which have an impact on local government, whether it's creating the Office of Rail Safety, which would be looking at railroad crossings and the length of trains, transportation funding, potential modifications to stationary plan language in the past. Number 3 is drones, right? Carson, you want to just take 30 seconds to talk drones? Not me, I'm talking like the plane drones.
Yeah, so the Transportation Interim Committee tasked UDOT a few years ago, I think 2 years ago, with a study on air mobility, which is drone delivery for the most part. That group, UDOT's team came back and presented the findings of the study. Their findings are on their website. But I think I don't know if this bill this year will affect local land use authority around drone planning, but drones require some interaction usually with the land, and that land may be in your land or in your cities. Sorry, struggling today. So I think one of the issues UDOT identified was that there may be some need for some common land use for vertiport liftoff stations. That's a lot of jargon. I don't actually know what it means in practice. Yeah.
That's swanky.
Yeah.
This could be a bill at some point in the future that looks like a small bill or small cells legislation where it required some uniformity among how cities require fees and plan for these. But I just want to mention and put it on your radar. This may not be this year, but at some point we're going to have a bill that has something to do with air mobility and land use. So just heads up.
So for those who are keeping track at home, we've used Italy Diddly in this meeting and
Vertiport stations, I think is
Vertiport lift stations.
something like that, yeah.
Yeah, quite the meeting. Quite the meeting here. In addition, the road usage amendments piece, we've been pushing to make sure local governments are part of Utah's eventual road usage program. Currently, the program that's underway has about 4,000 people in it, and cities do not receive any proceeds from the road usage charge program, but we're working on making sure that we are getting a portion of that money going forward. Additionally, we've got meetings with members of leadership about the fifth, which I brought up before, has been part of our counter proposal. Instead of withholding B and C revenue from local governments who aren't compliant with 462, change that fifth, which currently is 0.20 county imposed, that has to be imposed by the end of next June, or it expires, and 100% of that money goes to transit. What we've proposed has been to take that 0.20, allocate it between transit, cities, and counties, and then for Washington Terrace or South Jordan or West Point to qualify for those city dollars, you would have to be compliant with House Bill 462. And as we mentioned before, right now there are 7 cities that currently are on notice that they're not in compliance. So if that bill were in action today, those cities would not qualify for those dollars, whereas the compliant cities would.
Cam, can I ask a question real quick along those lines? Can you give an update as to where UAC is on that fifth discussion? I know we would like to see I know what we would like to see. We want the deadline extended past June. We're hoping to get to see that with the new formula. Any input from UAC?
Yes. So the question from Mayor Ramsey is input from UAC about the fifth. Let's see, what time is it? Okay, I'll give you the 60-second version is this. We've had mixed responses depending on the county. For example, only one county has imposed the fifth thus far. That's Summit County. So our proposal has been to focus on the counties that have not yet imposed the fifth. Summit County is concerned that the legislature may come back and claw back some of the money that they've already imposed and are looking to bond against for their transit system up there. Meanwhile, we've chatted with the urban counties. I personally have chatted with commissioners or mayors in all 4 of the main urban counties along the Wasatch Front, all of whom have expressed interest but aren't willing to commit to potentially making the change to the fifth. The reason I say they're interested is they're concerned about the deadline and the sunset. What we've tried to say to them is this would provide more flexibility, get more people at the table, so that in Utah County, it's not just the Utah County Commissioners imposing it, it's Utah County Commissioners plus all the mayors saying this is a holistic view to planning for growth in Utah County, and we can meet all of these needs with this additional revenue. And then the other piece is the fifth does not apply to counties that do not have transit, and there's been a lot of chatter from counties, rural counties like Sanpete County, and others that don't have transit of qualifying to be able to impose the fifth, which in turn would mean instead of just repurposing existing dollars, you could make the argument that it's now turned into a tax increase because those counties can't impose it now, but they would be potentially imposing it later. And the politics of a tax increase at the Capitol this year with the crazy economy meets the one-time surpluses is really complicated. But again, lots of moving pieces. UAC has their conference this week in southern Utah, so I hope we'll have a little more clarity when we circle back with them next week. Andrew, anything you want to add there?
No, you're good.
Okay. Phew. Is there anything else on the agenda, Justin? Any final questions? We didn't have any action items for you to vote on today, but as you see, there are a lot of moving parts, and I anticipate in December there will be action items, and then certainly come January, there will be a ton. So any final questions for any league staff members? Yeah, well, I was just going to mention one last thing is we are losing Susan Wood. This will be her last LPC as a member of league staff. So Susan, thank you. And then we'll be losing John Oliver, who's done our camera work at the end of the year. But just want to thank Susan for her contributions to the league, as she will be staying in the league family. Yep. But she'll be joining Sandy City in a couple of weeks. So good luck to Susan, and then we'll be advertising for a communications director this week. Okay, Mayor Silvestrini, you had Mayor Kafusi, you can take the motion. I'll get out of your way.
I need a
And go
motion
Utes.
to adjourn, and I got one, and I need a second. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Okay, next meeting is December 12th. Thank you.